Okay guys, so I know it's probably been a while since we've talked about solving quadratics, and you guys have your test coming up next week, so I wanted to give you a video that goes over the in-class review that you can find in the module that's titled Solving Quadratics Review Materials. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of these questions with you, kind of like we would have done if we had had a review day in class. If you have any further questions about any of them, feel free to send me a Canvas message or attend one of the web meetings that I do every day. So it's like a conference call, basically, where you can see me and speak to me face to face. I do those every blue day, either from 8:30 to 9:30 in the morning or from 1:30 to 2:30 in the afternoon. So feel free to join in anytime you want, even if it's just to say hi. I don't mind. All right, so without further ado, here we go. The first one says, which function has roots -2 and 4 in its graph? So when you're solving a problem like this, it's important to remember that your roots are always the opposite of what's inside the parentheses. So since I have a -2 here, I'm looking for something that has x plus 2 in one of the parentheses. So if you look, this one has an x minus 2, and so does this one, so that automatically eliminates both of those answers. And then the 4 here tells me I need to have x minus 4 because that's the opposite of positive 4. So if I'm looking at my two remaining answers, the only one that can be right is C. Okay? So the reason why they're the opposite, remember, you're setting each parenthesis equal to 0 and then solving. So once you solve, you have to use opposite operations in order to get x by itself. So that's why the answer is always the opposite of what's in the parentheses. Okay? Number 2, what are the zeros for the following function? We have x squared plus 5x minus 24. So when I'm looking at this, I see that a is equal to 1. So I'm going to use the big X method. That's where I put -24 in the top and 5 in the bottom. Now the two numbers that work here are going to be 8 and -3. Remember, you're looking for two numbers that would multiply to -24 but add to +5. So it's important that you be careful with the signs on these types of problems because if I remember correctly, a lot of us struggled a little bit with that portion of the quiz when we took this, I don't know how many days ago, okay? So when I go to write my answer, or my factors rather, it's going to be x plus 8 because that 8 is positive, and x minus 3 because the 3 is negative, and the whole thing is still equal to 0. So here again, remember, I'm looking for the solutions here. So I'm going to take each set of parentheses and set them equal to 0. X plus 8 equals 0, and x minus 3 equals 0. And like I said before, when you solve, you have to use opposite operations. So I get x equals -8, and here I'm going to add 3, and I get x equals 3. So my answers are -8 and 3, which is right here, letter B. Okay? I know I told you guys in class before, but I just want to remind you, if you can do all of this without showing this work down here at the bottom, I'm okay with that. Plus, your test is online, so I guess I'll never really know either. So just make sure that you're being super careful when you're doing those. Okay. Number 3 has two parts here, and I've done that on purpose. So the first one says factor the equation x squared plus 3x minus 18, and the other is solve it. So there's a very, very specific thing that's different between these two things. Now, they start out the same. A is 1 again, so I'm going to use the big X. I'm going to put -18 on top, and I'm going to put 3 on the bottom. Now, the two numbers that work are going to be 6 and -3. So I found my two factors, so this factors into x plus 6 and x minus 3. Those are my two factors, and I would be done. If I was asked just to factor it, this would be my answer. Now, this one says solve the equation x squared plus 3x minus 18. Now, this side of the equation here still factors to the same thing as this. So now I'm going to have x plus 6 in parentheses and x minus 3, but now it's equal to 0. So the main difference between these two types of problems is the solving requires you to find the x that makes the expression 0. For this one, I just want you to factor it, and basically you're simplifying it into two sets of binomials multiplied together. So you got to take it one step further when you're solving. So I'm going to do x plus 6 equals 0 and x minus 3 equals 0. I'm going to subtract 6 here and get x equals -6. And I'm going to add 3 here and I get x equals 3. Again, big difference between solve and factor. It's really not a huge difference. It's just that Solving wants you to take it one step further and find the value for x that makes the equation 0. For factoring, we're just finding the factors so that we can simplify it into two binomials being multiplied together. Remember that, okay? All right. For questions 4 to 7, solve the quadratic equation using the method of your choice. Round to the nearest hundredth when necessary. So you are completely in control of which method you choose. Now remember, there are 3 methods that we talked about. The first one was solving by factoring, which is what I did above. You can use the big X. You can use split the middle if you want to. Most of the time, I only use the factoring method when A is equal to 1 and it factors, just because it's the fastest way to do it. If A is not 1, typically what I'll do is automatically use the quadratic formula, simply because I don't want to split the middle. But if you prefer split the middle, please, by all means, try to make it work. If it doesn't work, if you cannot split the middle so that you can factor it, you have to use the quadratic formula. Now, when you take the test next week on Thursday, you will be given the formulas that you need, so please don't stress out about that. I'll make sure you have them so you don't have to memorize them. And then the last method that we used was called the square root method. And if you remember, you want to use that when there's no B term, okay? Or if you have parentheses squared. That's the big giveaway to use that. So, number 4, I already have 2 factors side by side, 2 binomials. So it looks like someone's already done the work for me. It's already factored. So I am definitely not going to do anything crazy. I'm not going to multiply and then refactor it. You'll just get the same thing back. When you get a problem like this, you want to automatically set each part equal to 0 and solve. That's all you have to do for ones like these. Don't overthink it. This should be the simplest one. So I'm going to get x equals 7 over 2 on that one. And for this one, I'm going to get x equals negative 5/4. So then my answers are just 7 over 2 and negative 5/4. That would be the answer. Now, when I look at number 5, I see that I have parentheses squared. So I'm going to use the square root method here. So first, you got to get rid of anything that is in front or behind the parentheses. So I'm going to do that. Let's see, 31 minus 4 is 27. Then I'm going to divide by a third. You could also multiply by 3 here. That will work as well. I'm trying to think. 81, yeah. Minus 4 squared is 81. Now, the parentheses are by themselves, and what I mean by that is there's nothing in front and nothing behind them. So I can get rid of the square root. It's equal to a positive, so that means I can keep going. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides, and I'm going to get x minus 4. Oops. Equals plus or minus 9. Do not forget the plus or minus. It makes all the difference, okay? The square root of 81 is 9. That's where that came from. All right, so now I'm going to split this equation up. I'm going to have x minus 4 is 9, and I'm going to have x minus 4 is negative 9. And in either case, I'm going to add 4 to solve for x. So I'm going to get x equals 13, and I'm going to get x equals negative 5. So my 2 solutions for number 5 are 13 and negative 5. All right. Number 6. At first glance, I only see 2 terms over here, but the one right here that has the x is a b term, so this is not going to be the square root method. So the first thing I'm going to have to do is get this 20 over here. The only method that you don't want equal to 0 is this one, the square root method. All the other methods must be equal to 0 before you can start solving. So I'm going to subtract 20 on both sides. 2x squared plus 3x minus 20 is 0. Now here's the thing. You want to make sure you check for a GCF first because it might make your life easier. There is no GCF here because of this 3. It ruins everything. So since a is not 1, I am going to use the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula is the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now, if you guys remember in class, I liked to do this part underneath first. Sometimes it saves me steps if I end up with a negative number, and it also doesn't make it look as crowded. So if I do this part first, b squared minus 4ac, I'm going to get 3 squared, which is 9, minus 4 times 2 times negative 20. Remember, this is A, this is B, this is C, okay? When I multiply that out, I'm going to get 169, and now I can plug everything into the formula, okay? So the opposite of B is negative 3. Then I have plus or minus the square root of 169 all over 2 times A, and A is 2. Now, we're in luck here because 169 is a perfect square. So when I simplify that, I'm going to get negative, I'm going to put this way over here, negative 3 plus or minus 13 all over 2 times 2 is 4. So since I don't have any more radicals, I don't have to worry about simplifying. I just want to find the 2 answers here. And by simplifying, I mean you don't have to simplify the radical anymore. So this is the same as negative 3 plus 13 over 4 and negative 3 minus 13 over 4. Here I'm going to get 10 over 4, which is the same as 5 over 2. And here I'm going to get negative 16 over 4, which is negative 4. Okay, so my 2 answers for number 6 are 5 over 2 and negative 4. This is an and, not a plus sign, just so you know. Okay? All right, number 7. Again, I only have 2 terms over here, but you got to be careful. Look, this one has an x with it. So the b term is here. Now, it's already equal to 0, which means there's no c. When this happens, both terms have an x. Factor that out, guys. That's a GCF. But they also have a number in common. 4 goes into 16, so 4x is the GCF. So when I take out the 4x squared divided by 4x is just x. And negative 16x divided by 4x is negative 4. When you take that GCF out, the square is gone now, so I factored it. This is basically it. You can imagine that this is its own set of parentheses. I'm going to set each part equal to 0 and solve. So I have 4x equals 0, and I have x minus 4 equals 0. Divide by 4 here. I get x equals 0. Add 4 here. I get x equals 4. So my solutions are 0 and 4. Okay? Again, guys, if you have any questions over any of these problems that I'm doing here, feel free to hit me up in a Canvas message or make sure to visit one of my conferences. There's 2 sessions. All right. Number 8. Again, same things. Solve the quadratic equation using the method of your choice. Round to the nearest hundredth when necessary. You can also put your answers in simplified radicals. I'm good with that too. All right, number 8, it's already equal to 0. There are 3 terms. A is not 1. You can try to split the middle here. I honestly don't know if it works. I'm just going to go ahead and use the quadratic formula, okay? So again, that would be the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And again, you don't need to memorize that. All right, so a is 2, b is negative 3, c is negative 5. So let's do the b squared minus 4ac part. B squared, that's negative 3 squared, is going to be 9 minus 4 times A is 2, times C, which is negative 5. When I multiply that out, I am going to get 49 here. Again, a perfect square, so that's going to make our life easy. Let's plug everything in. The opposite of B is a positive 3 this time. Plus or minus the square root of 49 all over 2 times 2 in this case, because A is 2. Okay, now the square root of 49 is 7, so I have 3 plus or minus 7 over 4. And once again, I'm going to split that up into 2. So I'm going to have 3 plus 7 over 4, and I'm going to have 3 minus 7 over 4. 3 plus 7 is 10 over 4 is 5 halves again. And then 3 minus 7 is negative 4 over 4 is negative 1. So my 2 solutions for number 8 are 5 over 2 and negative 1. Okay? All right, number 9. 2 terms on this side, and there's no b term over here, and this is just a constant. That means the b term is completely missing from this equation, so I'm going to use the square root method. This is the only method where you don't want it equal to 0, so your goal is to get that x squared by itself instead. So I'm going to subtract the 5. I get x squared is 162, I believe, if I can do math. Yep, 162. This is by itself and equal to a positive, so I can take the square root. So I'm going to get x equals plus or minus the square root of 162. which we do need to simplify here. You can either get me the decimal and round to the nearest hundredth, or you can simplify the radical. So if you have one of those fancy calculators at home that'll simplify it for you, that's fine. Otherwise, we're going to have to go ahead and simplify it by hand. So the biggest perfect square that goes into 162 is 81, and that is being multiplied by 2. So I get 9 radical 2, which means my answer is plus or minus 9 radical 2. And that would be the entire answer. Okay? If you need further explanation on that, again, send me a message or join one of my conferences. All right, number 10. All right, so we have 2x squared plus 2x equals 12. Okay, I have a b term here, which means I'm not going to be able to use the square root method, so I need this to be equal to 0, so I'm going to subtract 12. That gives me 2x squared plus 2x minus 12 equals 0. Now, each of these are even. That means they're all divisible by 2, so I'm going to take that 2 out. So now I have 2 times x squared plus x minus 6 equals 0. So now I'm working on factoring everything that's inside the parentheses. A is equal to 1, so I'm going to try and use the big X. Negative 6 on top, positive 1 on bottom. The two numbers that are going to work here are 3 and negative 2. So now I have 2 times x plus 3 times x minus 2, again equal to 0. Now, the GCF this time is irrelevant because there's no variable with it, so you can just ignore it for now when you're trying to find your answer. I'm going to set these two things equal to 0 and solve. So x plus 3 equals 0 and x minus 2 equals 0. Here I would subtract 3, so I get x equals negative 3. Here I would add 2, so I get x equals 2. So my two solutions here are negative 3 and 2. Okay? All right, number 11. If you look, there is no b term here. No b term at all. So I want to get this x squared by itself. And to do that, I got to add the 4 first. So now I have 1/4 x squared equals 80. And then I'm going to divide by a 4th. You may also multiply by 4 here. That will work as well. So I get x squared is 320. Now, the x squared is by itself, and it's equal to a positive. So I can take the square root of both sides. I'm going to get x is plus or minus the square root of 320. Now, that's not a perfect square, but we do need to see if we can simplify it. Spoiler alert, you can. So let's practice that. 320. The biggest perfect square that goes into 320 is going to be 64. So 64 times 5. The square root of 64 is 8. So 8 radical 5. So my answer is going to be 8 equals plus or minus 8 radical 5. Okay? Alrighty. Number 12. 12 has 3 terms. One of them is a b term, so I cannot solve by the square root method. There is no GCF, and a is not 1, so I am going to use the quadratic formula, okay? So a is 3, b is negative 5, and c is negative 8. All right, b squared minus 4ac. b squared is 25 minus 4 times 3 times negative 8. All right, so when I multiply that out, I'm going to get 121. Okay, so now we're going to plug everything in. The opposite of b is positive 5 plus or minus the square root of 121 all over 2 times 3. Now 121, once again, is a perfect square. That meant that we could have factored this if we wanted to, just so you guys know. The square root of 121 is 11, so I have 5 plus or minus 11 over 6. So that means I have 5 plus 11 over 6 and 5 minus 11 over 6. 5 plus 11 is 16 over 6 is 8/3, I believe. Yep, 8/3. And then 5 minus 11 is negative 6 divided by 6 is negative 1. So my two solutions are 8/3 and negative 1. Okay? All right, number 13. If you look, there's no b term once again, which means I want to try the square root method. Got to get the x squared by itself. Do that by subtracting 5 first. So I have 2x squared equals 14. divide by 2, and you get x squared is 7. Now, the x squared's by itself and it's equal to a positive. That means I can take the square root, and I'm going to get x equals plus or minus the square root of 7. Now, there are no perfect squares that go into the radical 7, so I can leave it as plus or minus the square root of 7, or you could, again, find me the decimal, but I think it's just less work if you just give me the radical, so I'm okay with that. It's up to you. All right, 14. Once again, there are parentheses, so I'm going to use the square root method again. You want to get the parentheses by themselves. That means nothing in front, nothing in back, so I got to get rid of this 3. Now, this is very important, guys. You do not distribute the 3 here. To undo it, you would divide by 3. So you're going to get x minus 4 squared equals 14. Now the parentheses squared by themselves and they're equal to a positive. You can take the square root and you're going to get x minus 4 equals the square root, almost forgot, plus or minus the square root of 14. Now 14 is one of those weird numbers that looks like it should simplify more, but it doesn't. There's no perfect square that goes into 14 other than 1, so it will not simplify over here. However, I need this x to be by itself, so I'm going to add the 4 to the other side, and it's important to remember that that 4 goes in front of the plus or minus. I'm going to get x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 14, and that's just my answer. 4 plus or minus the square root of 14. All right, last one for the page. Again, there's a b term here. That means I need it to be equal to 0, so I'm going to add the 1 first. So I have 6x squared minus 12x plus 1 is equal to 0. I'm going to look for a GCF, but there isn't one because of that 1 at the end. So I'm going to go straight into the quadratic formula. So a is 6, b is negative 12, c is 1. Okay, so b squared minus 4ac. B squared is 144 minus 4 times 6 times 1. And let me see if I can do some math here really quick. Figure out what that mess is. It's going to be 120. This is 120. It's the first one we have that's not a perfect square. So I'll show you what's different about that. So now we have the opposite of b, which is 12. Plus or minus the square root of 120 all over 2 times 6. Now, 120 is not a perfect square, so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to simplify the radical like we have been before. So the square root of 120, the biggest perfect square that goes into that is actually a 4. So radical 4, radical 30, which just gives me 2 root 30. So this is going to become 12 plus or minus 2 root 30 over 12. Now, the one thing that you do need to take a look at here is what I called the trifecta. Remember the heart? You want to look at the numbers out in front. You must have all 3 numbers there in order to do this. If there's no number in front of the radical, you can't do it, okay? So if you look, 12, 2, and 12 are all divisible by 2. So I'm going to go ahead and take that 2 out. It's kind of like taking a GCF. You're going to divide. So 12 divided by 2 is 6, plus or minus. 2 divided by 2 is 1. You can put the 1 here if you want, but it's not required. I'm just going to put radical 30, because it's 1 radical 30, which is just radical 30. And 12 divided by 2 again is 6. So my final answer is 6 plus or minus radical 30 over 6. And that would be it for that one. Again, if you have more questions, please let me know. All right, last page of the review here. It says, describe and correct the error in factoring the polynomial. So if you look, we were given x squared plus 7x plus 15 is 5. There is a b term, so I am not going to solve by square roots. You're going to want to get it equal to 0 first. So I should have subtracted 5. Now, 15 minus 5 is 10, so they did that fine. X squared plus 7x plus 10 equals 0 is still good. So then they would have done the big X because a is equal to 1. 10 on top, 7 on bottom. The 2 numbers that work are 5 and 2. So these factors, x plus 5 and x plus 2, are just fine. But the error occurs here when they give their answers. So I'm going to go ahead and do the correction portion first. I'm going to start with the x plus 5 and x plus 2 equals 0, because that part was correct. But what they did not do is set each part equal to 0 to solve first. and I'm going to write that here. They didn't set the factors equal to 0 to solve. So in this case, your answers should actually be the opposite of the factors. Okay, so then what I mean by that is when I go to solve, I have to do opposite operations. So I'm going to end up with x equals -5, which is the opposite of the factor that is 5. And here I should subtract 2, and I get x equals -2, which again is the opposite of the 2 that I have in my factors there. So that's it for number 17. They did not set each factor equal to 0 to solve, and then your answers need to be the opposite of the factors. Okay? All right, a couple more questions here. 18, you have 465 square feet of fabric to make a circular play parachute for kids. What is the radius of the largest parachute you could make? Again, there's supposed to be a question mark here. Round to the nearest 1/10 of a foot. All right. Now pay attention, guys. Pay attention to the rounding here. So here's the formula you have to use. A is 465 square feet. Pi is 3.14. And R is what we're solving for. Now, this type of problem, again, doesn't have a B term, so we're going to use square roots to solve. The first thing that you're going to want to do is divide by 3.14. And it said round to the nearest 1/10 of a foot. 1/10 is the first decimal place. So that's going to give me 148.1, and that's equal to r squared. Okay? The square is by itself. It's equal to a positive, so my next step is to take the square root of each side. And normally when you take the square root, you get a plus or a minus, but this is a word problem, so you want to think about, does it make sense to have both plus and minus? Now, I can have a positive length for a radius, but I can't have a negative, so I definitely don't want to have the negative portion. So my answer is going to be just positive 12.2 feet. And it is important that you remember the label as well, ladies and gents. Please don't forget that, okay? And that's it for 18. The last 4 are going to go real quick, okay? So let me give you a little bit of a recap on discriminant, because that's what you need to understand in order to do this, okay? So the discriminant is that b squared minus 4ac portion of the quadratic formula. So when you're using that, it tells you what types of solutions you have on the graph. So remember, if your discriminant is positive, it means you're going to have 2 real solutions, and that also means that your graph will touch the x-axis twice, okay? If you have a number that is negative, it means you have no real solution. And if you think about it, the number that you get for the discriminant goes under the radical, and for algebra 1, you can't take the square root of a negative, which would give you the no real solution. That means your graph does not touch the x-axis. And lastly, if you get a discriminant of 0, that means that you have 1 real solution and your graph only touches the x-axis once. So knowing that information, we can answer all of these questions. 19 says, if the discriminant is blank, then the quadratic equation has no real solution. That has to be negative. Remember what I said. Negative means no real solution. Okay? 20. The discriminant of the quadratic equation graph below would be positive, negative, 0, or cannot be determined. I'm here to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, this is not going to be an answer ever. Do not circle that one. So I want to look and see how many times my graph touches the x-axis. And it's only once. It's right here, which means that my discriminant is 0. Okay? 21 says sketch a graph of a quadratic equation that has a discriminant of -4. So remember, negative means doesn't touch the x-axis. Now you have several options here, guys. Now you need to decide, do I want my graph to open up or do I want it to open down? If you choose open up, it must be above the x-axis, because those arrows mean that the graph goes on forever. So if you put it below and you have it facing up, those arrows are going to keep going and eventually touch the x-axis, okay? Your other option would be to go below the x-axis and open down, because again, if the arrows are going down, they need to be going away from the x-axis, because this discriminant is negative, which means no real solution, which means I don't touch the x-axis. Okay? One last problem. What is the discriminant of 2x squared minus x plus 1 equals 0? So remember, discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. And again, you'll be given all of the formulas that you need in order to do this test next week. So a is 2, b is -1. There's really a 1 here, even though it's not written. And c is 1. So b squared is -1 squared, which is just 1, minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is 1. And when I put all of that in my calculator, I'm going to get a -7. The question just says, what is the discriminant? So this would be your answer. If I asked you what type of solutions you had, you would say no real solution. If I asked you how many times the graph would touch the x-axis, you would say it does not touch the x-axis. So that's basically the discriminant in a nutshell here. Okay? That's the whole review. If you know how to do this and you know how to do the study guide, which looks just like this, guys, you'll be in good shape for the test on Thursday. I apologize for having 2 tests in the same week, but that's just how things fell, and I think you'll be okay. Just make sure you're doing your work every day. If you are stuck or you're confused on something, please reach out, guys. I can't know if something's wrong if you don't tell me, okay? So either send me a message or attend one of my conferences, okay? It's the button that says conference. It's located underneath the announcement button on the left-hand side of your Canvas page. So hit me up if you need some help. All right, guys? Good luck, and I hope you guys do well on the test.